Okay, we are going, or I'm going to reconvene the Board of Commissioners work session that started promptly at 4:30 last week and promptly continued at 4:30 and 30 seconds. So we're ready to go. The agenda was adopted. Discussion, we're starting with the art policy, go to the master plan, and then go to the budget. So with that, I guess we'll turn it over to you, Dena.
Thank you very much. We're going to go over the Waxhaw art policy first. And I think y'all were given the policy ahead of time. So just make sure that we are all good. All right, awesome. I'm going to start off with our background. In February 2010, the Waxhaw public art policy was adopted. There's a list up on the slide that basically tells you what was in that plan, that policy. We, as in the Park and Rec Advisory Board, worked on combining the art policy and plan over the last year. In 2000,
Just a point of clarity, PCR was not around in 2010. That was, that chart on that started with 2010, that dates back to some old committees. I believe it was the Beautification Committee. So.
the PCR took that policy
No,
and
I'm
the
just
next
saying,
policy.
back in 2010,
okay.
there was very little structure in place. In fact, the board didn't have rules of procedure at that point in time either.
Gotcha.
So you're dancing around a lot of different documents is my point, which makes this difficult for you. So we recognize that.
Okay. Thank you for your patience then. The 13 art plan was adopted, and then that had more like community engagements. That also the PCR looked at that plan as well to do the combining of the two documents. Both documents were utilized to bring forth a public art policy for our future of Waxhaw. Basically, taking those documents and then looking at it in a holistic kind of view to help us fit the needs of our current population and what our current needs are. We looked at the critical artwork criteria of the artwork and expressed more mediums in that document, and also the maintenance and the planning for future public art. In the budget, we have put in a small amount of money to help us maintain our current public art. We haven't been doing that up to this point, really. And then also with future planning, that would become with the CIP, or if we have a donor that would like to give public art to the town. With your consideration, we're asking if the public art policy can bring back to a regular scheduled meeting and to be adopted. As you have in front of you, you have an outline of the actual criterias, and then the document itself, and then an application. And I would welcome any questions.
I have some questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Who would be choosing the members of the diverse town committees? I'm sorry, yes, the selection, is that the selection jury chooses the diverse town committee members, right?
So
Hang on a second, though. By rule of procedure, the only group that can select or appoint a board is this group right here.
okay.
So that's a piece that you're going to have probably take a step back and say, hey, you're going to have to go back and look and work through that, because again, you picked up the 2010 policy. When I read through it, rules of procedure were put in place in 2015. they put a very specific item in there, only the Board of Commissioners appoints. And that's taken from the School of Government, and that's not an overstep or anything. It's just that as the town matured and modernized. So
Okay,
to that end, that has to be modified,
Okay.
okay?
And then the second thing I had, which should be another consideration that we should be discussing is how we're defining the diversity of these members. It says diverse town committees, members of diverse town committees, how we are choosing that, what committees these are. Just something that I take from my day job. I work for a search engine, and we have to be very careful that we're not offending certain groups of people. So when we say diversity, are we talking about, religion, race, political types of groups? I mean, we want to make sure we're not offending any groups of people as we're choosing artwork, and so I'm hoping that we have something we should consider is when we choose a diverse committee, that it's representative of maybe different groups. If that's what you're meaning for diverse.
The diverse, what we were taking it from the committees that are already in-house. So could be from Main Street, it could be from planning. So they're already committee members that y'all already chosen. So that's the diverse
That's
on.
what you're talking about.
Yes, ma'am.
So I think somehow we then need to consider how we're going to define, making sure that we're not offending people through different types of artwork, I think would be somehow we need to
So-
come up with.
Maybe the suggestion as you go back to rework it is to look around and see how other communities might address it. We compensate for and we acknowledge diversity in everything we do with boards and committees. So we handle that diversity in the appointment process and the round-robin interview
Interviews.
process that we go through.
Okay.
What I've seen in some of the towns that I've looked at, they're going for diversity of art capability, mediums, that kind of stuff as well. I would just encourage you to, keying off what you're saying, is to come back with some ideas on how we might approach that as we form the committee, because we have to form the specifics of the committee.
Would you like more like definitions? Or,
That would help.
okay.
That would help. But that, to your point, there's multiple layers of diversity there. And it might be as simple as, if we're going to choose from existing committees, which is a recommendation I hadn't even thought of, are we looking for some skills, and do we identify those skills in each of the committees ahead of time? I'll give you an example. A real good friend of mine, I would not think of Jim Weiland as being a part of the art jury. I know him very well. That's not his area of expertise. Well-rounded, well-cultured individual, but that's not something that he would necessarily.
So just so I'm clear, even when we ask for town committees, would you still like a definition of the qualifications needed for even the town committees that would be like
I think if you list the
quasi?
qualifications for the art jury, whatever we're calling it, that should suffice, because then we have to
Okay.
build it, and we can decide to select from within or select separate and distinct. Although I see why you're doing it as within, because it's project-based.
And they already have a vested interest of being on the town and everything, being part of the team. Okay, good question.
Over here. There was a clarification question I had. I'm looking for it right now, but there was some section in here where we would encourage and then pay people to submit proposals. I'll find it and get it to you for the interest of time.
Okay.
But I wanted clarity around what does that mean? If we're,
So that could have been in the plan?
invitation, selection jury, and paid to develop a proposal. An artist is invited by the selection jury and paid to develop a proposal. So if you're inviting 5 artists and we're going to pay them to develop, what does that really mean? Go further on that and explain what it is that we're doing through an
Can
invitation.
you tell me what page that is, please?
It's on page 2, under invitation. What does it mean? Because that's a budgetary item, if we're going to be paying people to consider Waxhaw as a place for their public art. Again, you don't have to do it now, but just add some clarity to that.
So after we go back to the PCR committee and work on this, is it okay to bring it back to another work session and then move forward?
Yeah, I'd add the step of just make sure it's passed, and maybe it already has, financial and legal. Is there any nuance to, hey, we're establishing budget items here, and we've had every board policy reviewed by our attorney just for consistency's sake, so I'd make sure that happens if you're ready, if it's at a point where it's ready for us to consider adoption.
Okay.
Or that will be one of the first questions that gets asked.
No worries.
Others? Okay, thank you.
All right. Our next one. We're bringing back the park master plan for consideration. Y'all had wonderful questions, and with Mr. John's help, we gave a synopsis of those question and responses. They were given out on the 17th, I think it was, and then also with the master plan is updated as well. We're just going to go through a couple slides to kind of get us back up to speed again, and then ask for any other questions and concerns.
John, welcome back, and thank you for your flexibility. I know you were close to being on your way last week. And
You picked the right Tuesday.
okay, good.
Yeah, I got him before he got in the car, so that was awesome. Alrighty, vision and our mission. Professional parks and recreation opportunities is our main vision. Our mission, recreate, educate, the arts, health, and quality of life, a well-rounded community. I think we're well on our way of doing that. After identifying our recreational assessment needs, we took a holistic look at the different levels of service that we provide, and also looking at our potential size and ability. At the 3/12 work session, we had a good question and answer session. Like I said earlier, y'all did awesome about giving us feedback that hopefully we gave proper responses back to you and help with any of those concerns. On April the 17th, we compiled all those summaries and sent it out, and then also put in red in the master plan so you can easily identify. One of the questions that didn't quite get answered that I wanted to bring up was metrics. I think, Mayor, that was one of your questions. So I went searching. We are fortunate to be a member of the national and the state Park and Rec associations. The National Park and Rec Association has a great way of helping smaller entities do metrics for their departments. So I'm looking into these tools to help us move forward and keep us up to date. So I just wanted to say that I'm already on that and seeing how we rank with other size and abilities, but also see what's out there that we can improve on. In front of you, you'll see a bigger map, because it's a little hard to read on the screen, of an updated connection and our town properties. We had wonderful help from our teammates of engineering planning. I really appreciate them. Helped us update the map, and then we look for our future possibilities, connections, and with our upcoming whatever like communities that come in, so we can be proactive about these connections. Just to reiterate.
It's going to be posted out on the website.
Yes, yes, sir.
You might just, until the master plan's approved, put draft 3 to 5 year priorities, just so the community doesn't get confused that this is already a commitment. And I'm not making any statement one way or the other on that, just clarity for the community.
Yes, sir. Just to reiterate, the recreation in Waxhaw that's already happening. We have over 15 signed up for this senior coffee. We're doing glass work this Thursday. The fitness class is starting to get going. Our fun days in the park look like we're going to have a wonderful summer. We actually moved the time up, so we're going to have a hot summer, it looks like, so we're trying to move up the time a little bit so it's easier for the kids to come out, and then later in the afternoon as well. So we are definitely moving forward with our recreation. With our surveys, we looked at that as a whole, and Jon can talk to this more, but the biking, the trails is really a top priority for our citizens, as it is mainly nationally as well. But we're also looked at some of the programs that they asked for specifically, and we are already working on that for the next program guide.
Well, just as Dena mentioned, I mean, nationally, just getting out and walking, that's the biggest thing you read about everywhere. But if you even go back and look at the plans and studies you've done over the years, how much focus there is on trails and connectivity and multi-use paths, and just about every study that we include either in the summary in section 2 or in the back in the appendix. So, and you have a pedestrian plan that we've noted in there, which is about the same age as the current Park and Rec plan. So it's time to even revisit that and make sure all those plans speak together, because I think that will go great strides to start to get more miles on the ground in all of your projects at the same time. Certainly there's a need for aquatics. The folks here that have that need are driving to Monroe or Charlotte, even over into South Carolina. Some would love. That's one of the things we heard about throughout the survey and all the workshops, that they wanted something here that they didn't have to get in their car and add to the congestion, that they could either walk to or just get to. So you've seen this slide before as part of the survey summary, so we wanted to put it back in here again, and it's mentioned a couple of times in the plan. And then in the needs assessment that we did throughout this, doing good things that you've done since you've only had a department now 4 years. You've got a good start on particularly on providing parks and facilities. Currently, we've listed that we still need a couple of parks in the 2019 timeframe, at least a neighborhood park of 10 or so acres, and then getting up to another community park. We think we've identified where those probably are going to be because you already got the property in there. But then looking ahead, 2029, it's time to look for the land now, or to start planning for some of the land you already have to add additional parks 10 years down the road as your population jumps another 5 to, and 5 is probably a conservative number on the population, but we know it's going to increase at least that much as a good guess, and probably even more by then.
This is a proposed pedestrian trail plan. Been working with the Carolina Thread Trail, looking at new opportunities to connect more neighborhoods, especially in our downtown area. So this again is something with an updated pedestrian plan would be greatly utilized. After considering the Park and Rec needs and assessments, community workshops, with the strategy plan being developed, it gives us a good foundation for future build-out of parks and recreational offerings. Next step. We would like the board to consider to bring back the Park and Rec Master Strategic Plan to the next available meeting for their consideration for adoption, and then we get to have exciting plans of CIP budget planning for the future. Any feedback?
Who wants to start?
Well,
Commissioner Wesley.
I know that you mentioned adding draft was for this map, correct? So, because when I'm looking at 3 things on here that we've not determined yet, so I'm just hesitant to even include that on the map. First one is the Water Tower Community Corner. I mean, obviously that's still in the park inventory, but we're not clear at this point if we're going to keep that as a park area, if we're going to sell it in the future. So I'm just a little hesitant about wording that way. Same with the Horton property, continuing seeking remaining land acquisition there. I don't want us to be locked in saying we can't develop this park unless we acquire additional land, because I think there's still enough area there to do a park even if we don't acquire more. And then obviously the Waxhaw Marvin Road, we need to have a plan before we can determine what needs to be done there, but we haven't determined doing first 2 phases of it or anything like that at this point without having a plan. So I'm just a little bit hesitant about the wording on this map. I don't know if anyone else feels the same.
I would agree with some of that, yes. Additionally, I would call out the skate park in the same sense that I would call it out in the plan. You have in here to conduct an assessment for advanced adult elements. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that request didn't come from the survey. It came from one member of the committee in reference to her husband. And however well-intentioned that desire is, we don't spend several $100,000s on a project because one person asks for it. We gotta have a community backing for that to be a need. And in my view, that park is a children's park. I don't think an adult could get much air off the top of there without knocking their head off on the sails. So I don't see the need to include an assessment or advanced adult elements being done there, or to expand it. That would be my comment there. So I would, to have it called out on the map as well, I would have a problem with that. nor have we decided specifically that the Monroe Roads facility will be a dog park. That's a suggestion, but we haven't decided
Well, that's
where
what
we want
this,
a dog park.
this plan shows the recommendations. It doesn't say that's gonna happen. Now, we can
Right.
put a, we can put a note on here that all projects are subject to, discussion of town board and staff in terms of prioritization and they may change that. Water tower, community corner, yeah, it's in play in a couple of different plans. So in this plan, it's looking at it more from a park and recreation standpoint. In the ULI, it's more of an economic developer, so.
I think the only the main thing was, saying amphitheater there. We've seen in other, I think the old Horton plan, maybe there was an amphitheater in that one too. So obviously we wouldn't need two. So by pointing out that this is where we're putting the amphitheater, that would be probably one of my concerns about that.
I also have a concern about, or at least a question, let me say, what am I looking at? Tom Creek Park, the creek landing. Where's the next closest creek landing? Because if we're going to make a landing for people to get in, we need to anticipate that they have an ability to get back out of the creek. If there isn't another creek landing for mile after mile after mile, is it responsible for us to be encouraging people to get in the creek if they can't get back out someplace nearby, that they have to travel back to where their car is? Children could be using this. I don't know where the nearest creek landing is. Maybe there is one, and that's
There's
convenient.
not one further down in Lancaster that
Okay.
I'm aware of at this moment.
Okay, so I would be trepidatious about putting efforts into phasing a creek landing there, at least for the time being.
And we also had that conversation probably 3 years ago in the Parks and Rec, when the former director was here, as do we even want to do that? My issue with that would be no, because you have 12-year-olds that go out without parent supervision. If there's a heavy rain and the creek is up, I can see them with their rafts or their floats going into that, going all the way down to 521 under the bridge. Where do they get out? How do they get out? How do they get back? This has not been thought out even to put this on a draft. This is a safety issue for our children.
I think
So,
it's,
go ahead.
I think with the points that have already been made with the map and then looking at what you have on here and things that we have not fully identified or discussed as really being a part of, this plan that you have for the town and, the citizens, it just needs to be identified that these are suggestions, that they are not set in stone, that they have not been decided, because if you put this out on the website as it is, it looks as though we have already agreed to do these things, and this is what we're moving forward on when we haven't done so already. So that just needs to be really clarified on a number of the issues already stated.
And maybe what would help is more of a clarification, not necessarily now, but how we're going to go through great master plan. But we also had a sidewalk master plan that highlighted $84 million, and we never took it to reality. And so how do you bring a master plan to reality? Let me give you an example. Town Creek Park. Probably wouldn't want to look at what we do with Town Creek Park, be it a creek landing or whatever, until we know what the county's going to do with the property right across the creek. So yes, we want to continue to enhance that park in whatever way makes sense, but there's variables there that we're uncertain of. So you can say we're committed to Town Creek Park, but we don't know exactly what it is until there's an assertion of, are they going to, is that going to be, continue to be a public facility? Is it going to be a private facility? What's it going to be? We have to be good stewards, good neighbors to that as we go forward. That would be one. I do have a question, because I am confused. I am not trying to insult anybody that has a railroad persuasion, but the town board in 2015 made an assertion that anything to do with the railroad in the park is a private endeavor, not something that the town would go forward with. And there were nothing that came forward in terms of private funding, whatever, to go fund the park, but the town could not get into the amusement park business. We gave some help to, for those that wanted to raise money for the caboose. That didn't go very far either. So personally, I struggle with this being in the park plan, and other than maybe as a reference to say, hey, we've looked at it, the town's not, unless you have some justification that we want to be in an amusement park and can show that, and I didn't see anything in here.
We've
That was discussed many, many, many public meetings before you, albeit, I understand. And it just, there was no financial model that made that whole for the town, regardless of how historic, what railroads mean to the town. That's why we have the footbridge, all that kind of stuff. I'm not trying to insult. It just was, the board reached a reality point that that's a significant investment. That's a resource investment. That's, so.
It was put in there for reference just to show the history, that the possibility of the history of what could be for Waxhaw, and that was the intent.
I think it's too provocative to leave it in there.
It doesn't say that.
I would suggest that it be removed.
And the
Yeah.
calling out of it on page 2-37.
Right.
Doesn't mean that if somebody wants to come forward with a private endeavor, we'll look at it. But that was the offer in the past, too.
It's easy to do.
And again, not trying to insult anybody my grandson would be very disappointed with me having this discussion in the first place because he loves trains.
Well, and perhaps when, in the design concept for a downtown park or something, that they can incorporate some type of train ideas and design, like as like kind of a theme or something, but you're just talking about actually having a caboose or,
The caboose and the actual railroad amusement aspect of actually, as it was discussed then, having the tracks, you go from one end to the map's in here. It was cost prohibitive from a town to do, and the individuals involved could not come up with private funding to do it. They'd asked the town for it, and at that point in time, the board said, no, that's not a business we want to be in. Too many other needs. Again, it was based upon the needs, priorities, needs.
Just to reiterate, the appendices that are in front of you are the ones that you probably have never seen before. That's the reason why we called those out. The other ones you've already come across your desk at one time or another. Did you have any questions about any of the other ones?
So I noticed in here that you also talked about partnerships with the schools.
Yes, sir.
Are you planning to review the draft plan with the schools for their input, or have you, or?
Not yet. Have not. I would love to have a partnership with our local schools. But again, trying to one thing at a time.
Right, but if we're dependent upon it, or include, at least from the Waxhaw standpoint, is there any value to do that, and can we help you get access, or do you even want it at this point?
It may be something you do as part of your meetings with the other municipalities in the county, to have the school board, or have the school present
Yeah.
at those, just as a group.
Great
talk with
idea.
them.
So, you know that we, Park and Rec, Union County, all the Parks and Rec municipalities meet quarterly. Is one, we're on the same page, we're not stepping on each other's toes with events and things like that as well. We're also try to help each other out when looking for partnerships as well. So that would be a great introduction, I think, would come. But we have that resource in our town, so it just
Right. Yeah.
be, it's like it organically should happen, so.
Okay. Who has other questions? Other questions? I'm assuming the current emphasis is, let's bring our current parks up to parks and buildings up to a minimum level, standard level of, I'll call it acceptability for lack of a better way to say it. Safety, maintenance, whatever. That is your primary focus issue.
Infrastructure, yes, sir.
Yeah, okay.
The idea was to present fewer goals or recommendations as there were in the 2012 plan, so you
Yeah.
can focus on more specific projects and get yourself up to that well-rounded community.
So this was meant to be more of an assessment need. And hopefully it gives you at least a clearer picture of what we're facing right now and what we could possibly move forward in the future.
And I think, as we've mentioned in the past, it's a fluid plan, so as things change over the years, you have the opportunity to make those modifications. It's a lot of master plans. You put all these elements in there, and not all of them, David Barnes, Horton being one, not all those will go into the final park. There may be an opportunity somewhere else that wasn't available at the time that plan was done, and it makes more sense. Like an amphitheater may make more sense somewhere else. But those things will happen, and you've still got an amphitheater. It just may not be exactly where it was.
Other questions?
Oh, I don't have any.
One of the things that I think would help us, so as you said, we saw the list again as to the priorities. You want projects. What I'm having trouble is translating this to that needs list. How do the 21 million in the first 5 years, or whatever it was, translate to that needs list such that if these are the highest priorities, do those projects translate? So some of them might be quick hits and easy to do and just get it out of the way, but do we have clear delineation? It's hard to tell in here, like a cheat sheet that says, here's the top 4, and here's the projects that correspond to those that you could select from, or the projects as defined as we expand. So on one hand, you might say we don't have enough land across the town. Here's 2 projects about land acquisition, but here's trails are really the number one, and walkability, you could say anything from the thread trail to put a trail within an existing land and let people walk around the land and create a, kind of like what we have at Prescott. I mean, it's a beautiful trail system.
Yep.
You can do that in an existing piece of property. If you can align that, I think that would help the board make decisions that align to our citizenry needs, as they stated them.
And balancing those needs with our budget.
And
I think that's
exactly,
gonna
that
be a
helps.
lot of conversation when we start going through our budget meetings.
Right. And again, to you, it may be intuitively obvious in here. It wasn't.
good.
It wasn't to at least to me. That's all.
If you have your Park and Rec budget plan, if you can go to EX7, EX8, the executive summary, where it says the different parks that are current parks. It's the very front, EX7, EX8. And that almost it coincides with the map as well. It would, what would be easy, because some of this is infrastructure and some of this is, was like on the books when I got here. So what would be easier to help you with that list and coincide the budget that goes accordingly to that list?
Scroll back to the list that showed the highest priorities.
Right there.
So if those are the priorities, how do the projects align to those priorities?
Okay.
Well, in the summary piece at the very beginning, I mean, we're talking about the aquatic facility, splash pads up in there, and then sort of the walking, biking piece. Some of that is trail, but a lot of that is within these park projects as well, where you're adding the
That's
trail
not what
piece.
doesn't
So you
come
want
out
to
as
see that a little
yeah.
clearer to you.
Okay.
So, okay.
Yeah. So I'm just
We
saying,
can-
hey, how do we make it clearer so we're,
So start lining up what the assessment, the infrastructure need with this list.
a lot of times the community asks for things and we give it to them, but they don't know we gave it to them. And then they go to Facebook and talk about it, or social media and talk about it. Then you have to go out and re-clarify and re-clarify. Let's just do it that way up front. You're close to it.
That's true.
You, it's intuitively obvious.
It helps to other people review.
Yeah.
It does, and new eyes helps me out a lot. It really does. Is there any other concerns?
I wouldn't take them as concerns, just clarifications. You did, this is good work,
Team effort.
good work. Other questions? So you're coming back to us in another work session, huh? You
Looks
just
like
love
it.
for-
That's okay.
Okay, I get it.
Alrighty. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. John, thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Not a problem.
I saw you.
Next up, Greg, budget. Greg, we're glad you're feeling better.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back and feeling better.
How would you like to, you gonna walk through a presentation?
Yeah, we have a PowerPoint tonight, and just to set the table first, what's coming around to you is the actual proposed budget that has the budget message in it, which is really the description of what's in the recommended budget. It's typical, it's in the form of a letter, but it also has charts and graphs, and it goes through kind of an overview, high-level overview, but it gives some detail of different sections about things really that have changed, that need to be highlighted or are significant. It talks about operational and also CIP type things, and I encourage each of you, when you get a moment, to read it. It's about 22 pages. The second section of the document's got the draft budget ordinance, which is actually the budget. That's what would be contemplated for adoption later. There's a section 3 that's got a draft fee schedule. We review the fee schedule each year and make any adjustments as needed. One thing that I would say that you may notice differently this year is it is much more legible. And Susan Lee in the Building Inspection Department kind of took the lead on trying to go through and make that document look better, cleaner, easier to understand, and just make it work a little bit better. If there's anything that's changed, we have highlighted that, but there's very few changes. There's a couple things that changed in the fire funding or fire fee area, and I think you're aware of those. but at your leisure, take the time to look at that. And that is what's in the bound document. We've got something for you later to hand out that's budget detail, but we're not passing that around yet. So what I'd ask you to do is just let us go through the PowerPoint.
And to be clear, this is a draft.
That's correct.
Yeah, okay.
So first of all, let me just thank the board for your work up to this point that started with the retreat, a good day and a half of discussion about things that you feel are priorities and focus areas, and a number of those areas we have work well underway. So I would like to thank the board for taking the time. You also have scheduled several work sessions throughout the spring to talk about different aspects and components that will roll into the budget for your consideration and adoption. And things that you've discussed have included the STP already. You've talked about facade grants and how those would roll into the next year. The board's done some work in the past year to clarify really what we do with outside organizations and agencies. And the approach is very clear, is that we need to have an exchange of services or goods, and we need to have that documented in a written form, whether it's MOU or a contract or some sort of document, such as we have with the Waxhaw Women's Club for parking. So that's really cleared the table in a lot of respects this year, is that you have made some decisions that have helped set this budget up for a fairly straightforward approach to the operating budget, and then another approach to the capital plan and capital improvements, and then on adoption, the ability to have even deeper discussions, further dialogue about what capital you wish to consider. The timing of the Parks and Rec Master Plan this year has allowed you to really focus on what Dena described as an assessment of needs, and to think through components, whether they're something that you want to focus on in the future, or if you want to pull it off a plan, and then those will not be items to be talked about in the CIP. And I think what we're, clearly we're not going to be coming back to you proposing that we have a train component in a park, for instance. So while those seem like they're in part revisiting the past, is really cleaning the deck of some things that may have been thrown out as a good idea at one time, but let's revisit it as part of the master plan. You've gone through some of that discussion. You're continuing that. It helps sharpen the focus with a CIP list. And I think what the budget's going to do is give you the capacity, and I'm going to use that word again, you have the capacity to pick some projects from a CIP list, whether they're park projects, road projects, building projects, whatever those projects are, and give staff some direction and parameters to come back to the board for your consideration to roll those into an adoptable CIP. And then we've talked to you a couple times now about a funding strategy, a financing strategy, and ways that we can deploy funds in the future to get projects on the ground. So with that, I just kind of set the table for the budget. Really, we're going to talk about the operational part tonight. We're going to talk about operational capital tonight. We're not going to start talking tonight about big new CIP projects. So if the expectation publicly is that, just wanted to clarify what the operational budget really consists of. So with that, the funds chart is the first slide up on the screen. And you'll notice that the general fund is the largest by far, about $11.8 million in proposed FY20. There is growth in that fund, and we'll talk about that in detail, or a little bit of detail in another slide. Our capital projects fund actually decreases, and we'll talk about that slightly, or some. The rental property is Niven Price Building, and then we have separately established, and I'm going to mention a couple of these that have been done over the last year or so that have been broken out for easier accountability, better transparency, better long-term tracking, and just kind of highlight those. But the cemetery fund is actually accounted for separately now. The capital improvement plan reserve is part of our CIP plan, and that's $650 that is funded this year that we're currently in. It's recommended that we continue on that planning formula to address the capacity needed for future projects, whether it's debt or pay as you go. The Police Explorers Fund is a fund that's specifically for dollars that are generated by the explorers and are utilized by that group. We've got two other funds there that have to do with police monies that are restricted, but those have to be accounted for separately. The Powell Bill Fund goes back to the name of the legislator that proposed it back years ago, but the Powell Bill is the dollars that are generated by the gas tax in the state, a portion of which are shared with the municipality based on road miles and population, and that fluctuates, and so you see a little bit of a decrease.
Is it really that high?
Well, what you're seeing there, and I'm going to clarify that a little bit more, is you're seeing a combination of two years in part.
Okay.
So then our STP, you're also seeing in the year a combination of 2 years funding, essentially. STP being last year the vehicle $25 tax that was implemented. The technology fund is a separate part of our building inspection and permitting fee that helps plan for technology and pay for technology internally. And then the building inspection fund, we highlighted that because that really is something that in previous years was part of the general fund and it was accounted for. However, it was quite difficult to see the difference in other functions such as planning, engineering, versus building inspection and how those work together. So building inspection fund completely accounted for separately, reported to the state separately, and the employees and the employee cost reside in that fund separately. So anytime we talk about employee personnel cost, part of those employee numbers are offloaded into building inspections, which really works, I'm going to use the term like an enterprise fund. We're not calling it an enterprise fund, but it's somewhat operational, like it needs to pay for itself. So you notice the net of all that down in the bottom right-hand corner is a little bit under $500,000 difference between the previous or the present year and the proposed future year. Just to get to revenue highlights, the tax rate is suggested to be unchanged at 38.5 cents. We do continue to see positive growth in the property tax base. The number of houses has been fairly steady this year. We had new starts on houses. We probably dropped down to a low of 20 one month in the 20s, but we've been back up into the 40s. So the fluctuation that occurred hasn't been a continual decrease in number of new starts on housing. We're in the 30 to 40 number of houses annually or monthly. Commercial still, there is commercial out there. It's not a tremendous amount, but the commercial, as you know, is happening. We have some new construction up on the north side of town right now. Sales and use tax, there is growth there as well, as any commercial that has retail component does show growth, and the economy still overall is in the strong column versus where it has been in the past. One thing that's quite significantly higher than some of the previous years is the budgeted investment revenue, and that's because there's been a real push to make sure that the funds that we do have on hand and we do hold in the banks or in other instruments are utilized properly and that they're managed, and so the investment revenue is quite a bit up, and we do highlight that in the budget message. And the last bullet is the increase in Parks and Revenue programming, programming revenue. And as you remember, we've talked with you about the increased cost in park programming is offset quite a bit in the park programming revenue. So you'll see numbers on both sides of the ledger. The revenue does not completely cover the expense, but it goes a long way toward covering those expenses of those new programming efforts that the Parks Department has worked on bringing forward. So in a pie chart format, really the takeaway here is that our largest revenue source by far is a real property tax, main component being houses and land. 62%. This is pretty typical across North Carolina when you look at the general fund. If you look at water, sewer, other funds, you'd see a little bit different mix there, but because this is our general fund, property tax is going to be number one, sales tax is number two. That is fairly standard. Our sales tax is at 18%, and you see the third column there, or pie slices, utility franchise tax, which is about 7%, and then a couple other revenue sources. Fairly typical of towns and cities across North Carolina. There's going to be a little bit of difference there, depending on whether you're on the coast or whether you're in a tourism-driven locality, but we are fairly typical for a suburban community. Just where are we with our fund balance, and to translate the word fund balance into a terminology for a citizen or a resident, it's your savings account. How much money do you have saved, and why would you save it? In governmental accounting, that's our fund balance, and the policy is that we want to have some savings, and the goal is 30 to 40%, and that's a range that has been established by the board and adopted by the board. And what that simply does is set up a policy so that there is cash on hand and there's an ability to pay the bills throughout the year, because the cash flow throughout the year varies. Go back to the chart that says 62% of the revenue is property tax. Property tax bills are due a certain time of the year. The month before those go out or before those collections start, the cash balance is probably going to hit its low point of the year. As the property tax starts coming in, then the cash balance starts building up, and so you might see a spike in the percentage if you did a day-by-day comparison, but we want the range to be between 30 and 40% per the board's policy on June 30. On June 30 of 2018, the unassigned fund balance was 42%, so we were slightly above the policy goal, which is great. And we'll talk about why that's great in just a minute, because what you've been able to accomplish as a board is to set a goal, give the staff direction, and then you have created capacity, again that word, and the ability to look at some of these capital projects that you've been discussing. And so you're going to have an opportunity to decide what you want to do with that excess capacity, and you're going to have the ability to look at project development, project planning, design, whatever you want to do, because we're calling that excess capacity your ability to seed a project. It's seed funding for a capital project or projects, and so that is there, and we want to point that out to you. That is good stewardship. It's good policy, and you put something in place as a board that allowed yourself and future boards to have flexibility to address the needs. On the expense side, general fund expense categories, 50% of our costs are personnel. That is, again, pretty standard across the board. It could be higher. In fact, there are communities where it is a good bit higher, but it's not anything unusual to have in a service-based organization, which we are. We're about serving our residents, serving our citizens, to have our personnel providing that service make up 50% of the overall cost. Those are police officers, those are Parks and Rec employees, those are public service employees, those are planners. They're the people who answer the phone when you call in the town hall. They are service providers. The second largest category at 40% is operating expenditures. Those are things that we really have to do, whether it's keep the lights on, water and sewer, pay your rent on buildings, buy and replace cars as they wear out, buy equipment as it's used and wears out, operate parks, postage. You're right down the line. What does it cost for a business to operate? That's in the operating expenditures category, which is about 40%. Capital expenditures is a smaller amount, $489,000. Those are some of your operational capital items. Those are going to be things we're going to talk about a little bit later, not in great detail, but if you think about a car, if you think about an enhancement to a park, so if we're talking about pouring a piece of sidewalk in a park, that's going to fall into our capital expenditures category. And then transfers to other funds, we can talk about that as well, but those are other activities that we account for separately at 6%. Of that 50% of our personnel costs, we had a number of positions that were requested this year, and you can imagine that as we grow, we're going to continue to have positions requested. And one of the things that we do as a staff is try to balance that in a annual fashion with the desire to provide capital, provide new operation, but also have people to provide service. Of the 8 positions that were requested, we are only recommending 1 this year. We have some strategies to provide the service desired with some of those other positions, whether they be through contract services as needed. So, for example, if a planning or engineering type position was requested, there is very likely a way to accommodate that using on-spot service from an engineering firm or a temporary employee for a particular task that has to be completed. The second item or second bullet point that third area that we looked at, retention efforts. We have had what I would say is slightly higher than average turnover in the last couple of years. We need to stay competitive in the regional market, and there is quite a difficult market right now, particularly in planning. We have a number of positions that are open. We have a couple of senior planning positions that are open, and we've lost a couple folks that are in the planning department. We have looked at our competitiveness in the region, and we've got some detail in the budget message just as to kind of where we think that stacks up. We have looked at what's happening in our surrounding jurisdictions. We need to keep our salary ranges competitive, and so we're suggesting a 2% market adjustment this year, and then a continuation of our merit program, which is between 0 and 2%. So an annual review would be assessed again this year, and then low end would be 0, higher end would be 2%, and so those are part of our retention efforts. The third highlighted area is a couple of our benefits. Our insurance is looked at, reviewed, and bid out every year. We did that again this year. We looked at a previous year that was higher utilization than we've had in the past couple of years. Actually, you probably haven't heard a whole lot about health insurance because we've had a couple good years in a row where we either had decreases or flat rates or almost no significant impact. We had a higher than usual utilization rate, and so when you say utilization, that's people are going to the doctor, they're having more prescriptions, they might have had surgery, so there's an impact to that, which means your rates may go up for a year. We still ended up at about a 9% overall rate increase, which is good when you come in the gate with a 22% proposal. We were able to stay with the same carrier, which is another good thing because there is benefit, and the way our program is set up is there is an ongoing benefit if you can have good utilization numbers, but there is an impact there. The second bullet is something we've already discussed, and I think there's been some talk about it with the league and different areas, that there is a contribution to the state retirement that the town makes, and that is increasing up this year. It's 1.2%, which is about a $60,000 impact. What I would point out is that we know the future year increases that are in front of the town. They're known, and they're something that we can budget for. So I know there are some municipalities that really looked at it as being, and I heard the words unfunded mandate, and I don't necessarily disagree, but I don't agree either that it's an unfunded mandate. It's a funded requirement, and the towns have to make their decision to fund that, because the second part of what's not said is the employees are already funding their share, and that part gets overlooked. There's about 6% that comes right off the employee's check, right off the top. So this is not a free benefit program that the employee has no skin in. This is something that's a partnership. It's a long-term partnership between employees that make the commitment to local government and that want to stay in local government for their career. So we know what those numbers are. They're not scary. they are big numbers. They're not insignificant, but we know that we need to budget for those, and it's something that makes us competitive with our other municipalities as well. Building inspections, again, we do account for that separately, and we meet the state requirements there and continue to provide a high level of service with about a 2-day turnaround on most things. What do our departments look like? These are our department breakout by percentage. Police is 41%, community development's at 21%, and then administration is a third at 18%. This is just expenditure numbers broken into a pie chart format for you. So, from an expenditure standpoint, what are some big things that we're saying the board should consider this year? And the first is,
Clarify something on the retirement. So 2020, 60,000. 2021, I'm trying to understand the chart here. You got, is it 60 plus 50? The net increase is 55 on top of the 60 from 2020 or 21?
Which page?
Page 11. Is it a cumulative effect, in other words?
yes,
So in 2021, it'll be the 60 plus the 55. No? You're going to be paying, you'll have paid the 60,000, and then on top of that in 2021, it's another 55,000 increase. Yeah, it's cumulative. That's on, yeah, okay. That's what I want to make sure of.
correct. So to get to the highlights of general fund expenditures, one thing that was alluded to, I guess, earlier is making our existing parks complete to the extent we can, safe to the extent we can, and what I would say is the first key thing is safe. We have some real needs in Nesbitt Park primarily to make that park safer, and part of that's to deal with things like fly balls. It's to deal with fencing that needs fence toppers. It's to deal with sidewalk that doesn't exist, and we have requests that we make those parks accessible to the elderly and to those that are handicapped. And so $80,000 of park safety items are highlighted here, because if you'll recall, one of the earlier slides showed kind of the overall capital. I'm going to call it operational capital. And there was not a huge spike there because we're spending capital each year. And last year, or the year we're in, we had about a $50,000 fiber project. So that's capital. That's not there this year. So we do have some operating capital capacity each year that we have the ability to fund, whether that's a car, a truck, a server, things like that. So we're saying we need to look at spending about $80,000 for park safety. And so we wanted to highlight that because that gets to what Jon and Dena talked about, is kind of making some of the existing parks more complete and getting them to a point where we feel like they're safer. The second bullet there is that there is a dedicated $100,000 of funding set aside to begin another project, whether that's one project or two projects, but to begin a planning phase of a capital project. That is separate and apart from the 2% over the 40% fund balance. So if you're adding there, we're about 350. There's about 250 in that 2% fund balance reserve, and then another 100 here. So there's $350,000 for project planning or some deployment for the board to look at what type of projects you want to do, and then give some staff, the staff, the direction to do some scope development, have some scope debate, talk about that, what it looks like, whether it's 1, 2, 3 projects, whether it's phased projects, and then begin to plan. And as Mitch talked with you a couple times about how these projects go to the LGC, if you're going to do a financed project, you can't take it to them and start asking them to give you the money 15 or 20 months out for a project that's just an idea. You have to develop that project. You've got to put some planning, engineering, design, get it to a point where you've got a bid. So we've got to have some sort of rolling fund to get a project ready.
And that number you quoted, that you're talking about, we saved more than the 30 to 40%, we saved 42%. And so you're taking it back to 40%? Because we could, if we wanted to, take it to 35% or 30% and still be within the 30 to 40%. We don't have to take it to the high end. We can take more money out if we choose to, if we decide to appropriate those funds for that.
What we're suggesting is you have at least $250,000 worth of capacity.
At least, yes.
The third bullet is there is a potential bicycle planning grant that might be able to be matched, and so we have added some capacity there for that grant if it's able to be put forward. The fourth, and we have a separate slide on this, is our solid waste contract costs continue to escalate, and that's simply based on the number of new houses that are added. And so that's about $125,000 this year based on some planning estimates that we've conducted. A slight increase for workers' comp, liability, and risk insurance expense. That's really not a lot. Some good news that I'll share as part of this tonight, because it's really not a budget item as much, but it relates directly to liability and risk insurance. As I think the town attorney shared with you a few months back, that there was a unfortunate death some time back that occurred in South Carolina, and the board and the town and the department had been pulled into that as an effort to try to look at who was responsible there. And we did receive news that the town has been released and that there is no ongoing effort in litigation in that particular death that happened. And so while we're still saddened with the tragedy that happened in South Carolina, glad to share that we're not a party to that suit currently. So that is some good news, and it did relate to our liability insurance there. We do have additional streetlight costs as they come online, as they're turned over, and so that's you're gonna continue to see that. One thing that we may want to consider in the future is a little bit of a standardized approach to streetlights, because what is a possibility is that we could see a year where we get a tremendous spike in the number of lights that are attempted to be turned over. One approach, and it might not be the right approach, but an approach is some systematic method of saying there's a set dollar figure that the board's able to fund each year, and when you hit that level, you're deferred until the next year before that turnover occurs. That might not be the policy that fits here. If a community has been in existence for 10 years and their HOA has been paying the streetlight bill, then maybe there's more of a need to turn it over quicker than to delay that another year, but that's something we might want to look at in the future. The last bullet there has to do with the election costs for this year. This is a number we've been notified by the county. It's their high-end number. It could be lower, but this is the estimate that they've given us for election costs. This slide gets to solid waste that we talked about a little bit. It goes back and just shows the actual numbers that we've looked at over the last couple of years. You'll see we're running about a 9-10% growth rate. Don't really see that slowing down. You know, there's been some common wisdom that the economy is going to slow at some point, and it sounds like it keeps bumping back, and so we really have not seen that in the number of residential new starts here. There is a number of lots that have been approved that will run out of eventually unless more lots come online, but we are not seeing that quite yet, so at least not in the next year. So we're looking at about close to 6,500 houses for next year. So it's about 1,000 houses more than we had a couple years ago. This slide really gets to that capital comparison year over year, and it kind of shows that it does fluctuate by department by year. And so this kind of shows you the impact. While the 80,000 with Park and Rec safety kind of sound like a lot, we actually spent 53,000 last year on different things in Park and Rec. We're spending money in the police as we always do to purchase vehicles and to address capital needs there. We're not doing the fiber project in the IT department this year. Public Services is not seeing as much capital, mainly in a vehicle or vehicles. We've got a vehicle in administration. And then one thing I'd highlight in finance is the 147 is really not new additional capital. That's really, we're not going to be able to get the work completed this year, this fiscal year, for the financial software. So we've got to budget the full amount next year. And so it's not new dollars, it's just dollars that won't be spent this year. So net overall, though, we're down slightly in the capital from last year by about $8,500. So kind of standardize capital operating purchases that have to be made just to kind of keep new cars coming in, trucks coming in, lawnmowers replaced, servers that have to be replaced as they hit the end of their useful life. So this just gives that snapshot of kind of the capital highlights.
So if I read this right, planning and development services, no capital.
No,
Inspections, is that treated separately in their budget then?
yeah, and they don't have anything capital-wise this year. If they had a truck, it would come out of their cost. One thing that we're working on right now is a fire marshal vehicle, but so the capital improvement plan continues to be worked on by the board, staff, Davenport and Company, and we've talked with you several times about that kind of capacity analysis, and about $5.8 million is out there as a future ability to finance. That's possible because of the continued funding of the CIP reserve fund. So that $650 going into the capital reserve fund helps make that capacity available. But this budget really doesn't call any particular expenditure of those dollars at this point. So it gives the board the ability to complete the Park and Rec master plan, have a discussion that you've talked about what other CIP projects exist. Matt, Dena, Lisa, others have done work on, that the grand, I'm gonna call it the grand CIP list, the grand CIP kind of wish list. And that's something we can come back to you and talk about it at one of the budget work sessions. The message, though, is that you've got the capacity to pick a project or projects or multiple projects, and that's really the framework of this budget gives you that opportunity. The STP, which started FY19, really is the shorter, smaller scope transportation projects. Call it tactical in nature, but this is the turning lane, the turning signal, could be a roundabout. It's the smaller things that really do make a difference, but there's a need for a funding category, and so you did put that in place. These are projects that are not going to typically qualify or be submitted. They might be submitted, but they're probably not going to qualify for CRTPO funding. There's a chance that they might qualify for DA money, but quite frankly, unless there's $1 million plus project, it's really just not worth dragging the federal strings into a local project, because there's a 30 to 40% cost of doing business with the federal government, because you've got to adopt all their rules and regulations and timeline. So this,
In addition to the match.
yep, and so STP gives you the opportunity to do something smaller. You've had some very good discussion, and I think we got some help and clarity in the STP discussion about kind of where the board is on some of the projects, what your priorities are. Let's look in town. Let's not look out of town. Let's look at 75. Let's see what we can do. There was some good feedback from that, and so this year we're going to see about $235,000 generated. There's a chart that shows kind of how that's come in year to date, and then how that will probably play out for the rest of the year. The first couple of months, it appears that really the only funds that were being generated were from new vehicle sales, so that they were catching those sales and getting the tax right away. And it took some time for the DMV to ramp that up. The number last year was frankly designed right off what the county provided us, and that budget estimate was about $305,000, but it's not come in. But that was the number that the county gave us as far as cars. So we look at 235 likely coming in this fiscal year, and then based on that trend from this year, right around 285 next year. So the STP fund will have about $520,000. The STP fund with the Powell bill added together is about $1 million available next year for transportation projects, whether those are on state roads, on town roads. There will be the ability to have a mixture of those, but that's the availability for projects. You have discussed some projects already, but you will continue discussing those in a future date. Kind of toward the end of the PowerPoint, I know there's been some discussion about having some additional budget work sessions, and so we've got up there dates to be determined. The public hearing is tentatively scheduled for May 28th, and the tentative adoption of the budget is June 11th. The good news this year is that we started off about 3 weeks ahead of the schedule from last year. And even with last week not having this work session and presentation, we're still about 2 weeks ahead of last year's schedule. So really we have the month of May to take the time, whatever time the board wants as far as work sessions. So the two dates that we're proposing that we stick to is the May 28th public hearing, and then looking at adoption on June 11th. We are ready, willing, and able to have budget work sessions, and so that's really the end of the formal presentation. We have a hard copy document for you to take that's budget detail. It's in large format because it won't fit on a small page without being so small you can't read it. So Lisa and Tammy probably have that for you to take with you. And with that, I think I'm done.
So what we agreed to as a board, we kind of went through a schedule, and I shared that with you and with the clerk's office this morning. Trying to get dates defined, and we're going to take advantage of our rules of procedure, Rule 31, that convene the meeting, recess for purposes of discussing the budget. And so the first one will be Friday. We'll have to call that as a meeting, and we're going to come, every board member is going to come prepared, having read this, as much detail as they want to, and here's the list of topics that we want to do a deeper dive on, and kind of consolidate that into a prioritized approach for you. Not to be answered there, but for then staff to work their way through with us on that. And hopefully, you know, there's a lot of good stuff in here, a lot of good stuff there. Hopefully that'll be a rather crisp process, but we'll get that meeting announcement out tomorrow. Did you already send it to me to sign? Okay. And so Monday we'll start with input as to maybe some clarification questions and/or here are the priority areas. So, is everybody okay with that? Okay, I guess I'm gonna get my readers out. I'll just say, before we adjourn this work session, a lot of good detailed work in here, so thank you for getting it to this level, and thank you for the crisp discussion. Is there any way you could send soft copy of those charts to us so we all have that as we're doing our prep?
Yeah, I think every chart in the PowerPoint is in the budget message. However, we can send the budget PowerPoint out to you separately as well.
Yeah, I saw that the graphics certainly were in there, so that's good. So we got our work cut out for us. It's going to be a fun day.
Yeah, just one caveat. The detail we passed out to you has got something on it. It says calculation, detail, estimates, and notes. So these are not really, this is not a bound publication, so you're probably going to find a typo in there somewhere. You're probably going to find a comma that's missing or something that's not capitalized, because it's really budgetary planning detail. I would say the same note of caution to everybody that we'd said about the Park Master Plan draft is these are planning level detailed notes that don't really mean that we're going to spend every dollar per category per every 57 pages of detail. So planning level documentation, it gives kind of insight as to backup and how do you build a budget from the ground up. You start for what does it cost to pay the light bill at town hall. So that's the detail.
Well, it's very easy to understand. 29, 20 difference. So this is great work. So, okay. All right. So with that, we can we'll adjourn the work session and take a few minutes to get ready for the. Unless anybody has any final comments they want to make. Okay. Thank you, Greg. Thank you.
Well,
Finance staff.
I'd like to thank the staff. I think we've had a lot of participation from our department heads this year. They had participation from their staffs in coming forward with budget recommendations that then have really been through several rounds of discussion. I'd like to thank the finance staff for their hard work trying to pull everything together. What you are seeing in the detailed notes has been transcribed a couple times because the system that we have doesn't readily allow you to hit print and spit all this stuff out. So it's actually been typed a couple different times to get it to where it's at and to get it into a format where you can almost read it with a microscope.
There's a comma missing in that last line item on the bottom.
You won't
Somebody's
see
gonna
it.
have to pick it out for me because I can't read it. But any other parting comments? Thank you very much. Thank you to staff for getting us to this level, and we'll begin the journey, continue the journey on Friday morning at 9. So with that, I'll adjourn the work session.